I don't know how old you are, but I can tell you that I'm old enough to remember using Netscape Navigator to browse the web in the 90s. And I can tell you that the web pages back then sucked. They had content, but their design was terrible. And notoriously, there's a 1990s web style that's sort of remembered fondly because of how terrible it was. It took some time to develop good design principles for the web. And now they're really standard fare, and products have them baked in when you build websites. We're just much smarter. Well, you could still say the same thing about interactive digital content. When you're building this stuff for a touchscreen, we're still a little green around the ears, right? We don't exactly know what those best practices are, or maybe you don't, but we do. And that's what this video is all about, is to try to move forward the discipline of creating interactive digital content for public spaces, for in-venue deployments. I'm now going to share with you what we believe are the 10 design principles you need to know. We've learned this from our customers based on our own mistakes. We hope you find these valuable. The first tip is about knowing your audience. Not just the people you want to talk to, but the people that might show up at your kiosk, at your digital sign, what have you. Maybe it's in the workplace, a museum. It's going to determine the age, maybe the gender, some aspect of the demographic, and who will most likely be using that kiosk. Who are they? What makes them tick? You also need to make sure that your audience, if they don't have some comfort level with the technology, can develop that comfort level based on the tips that you give them in the experience itself, to be very explicit about what they need to do to be successful. And you need to keep in mind things like accessibility. Some of the people in your audience might be wheelchair bound, they might be colorblind, they might have difficulty seeing or hearing. How much do you depend on the UI to accommodate these users? How is the screen going to be mounted, and what color schemes you're going to use? Make sure you understand, again, not just who you want to interact with, but everybody who will. The second principle is to keep it simple. You can do really advanced things with interactivity, but it doesn't mean you should. And in fact, typically you have some objectives, some reason you want people to interact with that content. Keep that journey as simple and as quick as possible. Emphasize visuals over text because a picture's worth 1,000 words. Try to not over-engineer. Make it easy for people to figure out how to navigate, how to find what they're interested in. And assume that folks maybe aren't just used to using touch displays. And we call it sort of the fat finger principle of if I have a website on my screen with all these little tiny links, are they going to hit the right links? Are they going to hit another link accidentally? Don't put websites on touch screens. Build experiences that are easy to understand, easy to navigate, and easy to be successful with. Now let's talk about attracting attention. How do you catch people's attention as they walk by, as they browse the shelves, they walk through the museum? How do you get them to notice? Well, a good practice here is to build an attract loop, something visual, something with movement that catches their eye. We're more likely as a species to notice things more if there's movement than if there isn't. So something that makes it obvious that there's interesting content and something to interact with. Make sure you take the environment into consideration. Is it very loud? Is it very bright? Is it hard to see things? At the very least, you need to make sure that your installation is in a place where people can easily see it to accommodate the fact that they may not notice it otherwise. Alternatively, is it a quiet space? Then you don't need loud audio because that will just make it offensive. When you have multiple users, you also need to anticipate how you should transition from one to the other. How do you handle the fact that one user has finished, they've left, it's just sitting there? What can you do to go back to something that will attract attention, but not do it before somebody is finished? You need to think about this transition from one user to the next to make sure that it's ready to attract new attention, but doesn't steal focus from an existing audience. You can use things like sensors, proximity detection to kind of give you the content some hard environmental feedback that people are present. And you can use that to trigger sort of a new attract loop. You have the generic attract loop, but nobody is nearby. But when somebody's nearby, you trigger something else. Maybe it's a siren or something like that, which is not good for a quiet environment. And then, of course, consider the enclosure itself. If it's really nondescript, if it's table mounted, people won't even notice it unless you do something with the enclosure, with the mounting to further attract that kind of attention. Let's move on to tip number 4, which is about respecting privacy. We need to make sure that people feel comfortable using your content. And this can manifest itself in a variety of ways. I mean, first of all, the screen design is influenced by the intimacy of the decisions your visitors will make. You want a big wall display if you want people to notice, if you want it to be visible, if you want audiences to see other people using your content. You're encouraging that kind of communal interaction. On the other hand, if this is meant to be private, you don't want a large wall-mounted display where people are typing in a credit card number. You need something much more intimate. Maybe it's table-mounted, maybe it's angled a little bit, it's a smaller display, maybe there's a privacy screen on it. I mean, these are decisions you need to make. If you are going to collect personal information, there are a variety of standards globally and locally that now insist that you be very clear that that information is being collected, that you proactively say, is it okay if I collect this information? It's an opt-in and not an opt-out. That way people know consciously that they've made this commitment and it's okay for you to collect it. Do not collect information without people's notice. Back to this notion of mounting, we sort of reinforce the fact that the way you mount that screen can influence privacy. And back to the larger screen, that does encourage interaction. So when you use a table mount, you're typically saying either it's private or I guess it's communal if everybody is standing around it, but again, how are people going to notice, right? So, if it's a smaller kiosk, something where there's some level of privacy, that would be better. Whereas those larger screens, it's waving to people throughout the store, the workplace, the museum, hey, come on over, there's some cool stuff here. Tip number 5, this is about analytics. It's about measuring. It's the beauty of interactive digital content. You actually have things in context you can measure. You know what people are doing. You know when they do it. You might have context. What's the weather outside? What's a sports score? You have all this information collected. It will teach you things about your audience. So one of the first things you need to do when building an experience is, what do we want to measure? What do we want to learn from this deployment? Is it dwell time? Is it level of engagement? Is it item popularity? And how are they influenced by the environment? You're going to love having this information because it's going to teach you what works, what doesn't work, and what you need to tweak. That's what we mean by context, by getting all this environmental information. It doesn't just have to be limited to what's on the screen. One of the beauties of Intuiface is through interface assets, you can interface with things in the cloud, with the network, with sensors. You can learn things about the environment. It could be a camera giving you age, gender, number of people, level of attention, or it could just be news services and weather services, all of which can help you understand better how your users are influenced, your audience is influenced by that context. Make sure you assess these stats on a frequent basis, over time, over an hour, over a day, over a week, over seasons, to see how things might change and to see if the changes you're making are having any effect. So it's really critical that these key performance indicators are very well defined and identified to make sure you're measuring the right stuff. Let's move on to hardware, because hardware can also influence the quality of your audience's engagement. Now, there's some obvious things like just performance. It needs to perform well. But let's talk about displays. You know, we've discussed this earlier in this list of tips that, well, the size of the display has an enormous impact on how well people notice the content, whether or not it attracts their attention, brings them over, whether or not it gives them a certain level of privacy. Your visuals will also be influenced by that, of course. Big screens, big stuff, small screens. Well, how much stuff can you cram in there? You need to be smart about it. There is from a budget perspective, you need to consider this trade-off between performance and the overall cost of the deployment. Very often, good enough is probably good enough, but you got to test to make sure. But do you really need, 60 concurrent touch points on your screen? Not if it's one screen. I don't think so. If it's a multi-screen display wall where multiple people could be doing different things at the same time, maybe, could be. So consider all these factors. Don't go overboard. Get just what you need and no more than that. And then finally, there's issues of protection and security. If it's a children's museum, these devices are going to be handled differently than if they're in some, the Museum of Modern Art. So the enclosures, the levels of security, how do you make sure people don't run off with stuff, they don't break things? This is part of your expense. It's part of your budget to consider how it will be installed, and how it's going to look. Moving on to tip number 7, having a clear call to action. We touched on this topic a little bit earlier when discussing the clarity of your design to make sure people understand how to achieve the end that you want them to achieve. That, broadly speaking, is called the call to action. What do you want them to do? You need to be very clear about this. If it is not sort of intuitive from the installation and from the environment, you need to kind of tell them, what can you do with this kiosk? What is possible, and how can you achieve it? Does your design do that? Back to this notion of simplicity, avoid clutter, be clear and concise in what people are seeing and what you're directing them to do. You might be all excited to do this funky visual stuff, but if it distracts them from the ultimate goal, you're not helping yourself. Are there ways to incent people to fulfill this call to action? Do they want to follow the steps you're giving them? If you're making them do a 10-step thing on their screen and there's nothing rewarding about that, they're not going to do it. So either keep it very, very simple and quick, or give them a reason to go on. Some visuals, something that will give them a cause to continue through what hopefully is not a very complicated process. And then measure. I mean, back to the analytics point, keep an eye on what people are doing, where they get stuck, where they drop off. Learn what keeps them engaged and what doesn't, so you can continue to adjust that experience and make it more successful. Let's talk about designing for usability, to making sure your users feel in control. Again, it's a variation on the notion of simple, straightforward design, but let's be a little more specific. Give directions. Yes, pictures are worth 1,000 words, but if you can just say pinch to zoom, that's not a lot of words. Maybe that's helpful. Be very specific at what they need to do and be respectful of their time. Don't come up with complicated things. Keep it really, really simple. You might want to use what's called in the industry breadcrumbs, the sort of visual representation of each step the user has taken in that content you've developed for them. They know where they've been. They have an idea of where they're going. Give them a sense of place so they don't feel lost. Can you get back to home? So this is another one. If people are down a path they didn't want to go down, or if the attract loop hasn't kicked in and somebody has walked up, is it obvious how you can start over? Is there a home, a restart, a do-over button, some sort of process for getting it back to the beginning? Make sure that's very, very obvious. And then do something to provide feedback. If there's a level of interaction, you want the people to know that it was recognized. If you accept interaction, but nothing visually happens, you hear nothing at all, people might think it's not working, right? This seems obvious, but we see it all the time where some process is happening, some level of transition is occurring. It's not immediately obvious. The audience has no idea, so they give up or they hit over and over again. You don't want that, right? So make sure you can give people this feedback while, again, being sensitive to the needs of accessibility, where people may not hear things. So is there a visual? Or maybe they don't see well. Is there some auditory feedback? Make sure you balance that out. Tip number 9, testing, testing, testing. You got stuff wrong. I don't know what it is, but something you did was wrong. And the only way you're going to know is to test it. Now, maybe it's a design choice. Maybe it's something about the process. Maybe it's your assumption of the users. All of these things influence your output, and some of them are probably wrong. Always run a pilot. Get it out there on one screen with a test audience. What do they do? What do they see? What did they learn? Measure, measure, measure to learn what you can from this first level of engagement. Don't throw it on 50 screens and hope that it's going to work. Think about that location, right? So how does it work next to this wall? How does it work next to that wall? If it's a remote deployment, visit the location. Is it visible from the front door where it needs to be, or from the counter, or whatever, right? Get yourself in that environment where you told things that are not right about that environment. You made bad assumptions about where this installation would go. Check it, test it. You might have to change it. What is there a network dependency? What is the network environment you're anticipating? Is it for real as fast as they say it is, or as slow as they say it is? Because you know what? Stereotype here, installations in a shopping mall, not always the best network connection. It's not pretty quick. So if you're trying to download gigabyte videos on the fly, it's just not going to work. might work in your test lab back at the office, but it's not working in the mall. So don't just ask, verify, and make sure what kind of network speeds you can expect and accommodate the reality and build experiences that can scale appropriately. And then finally, just assume that the person driving this project, the people with the need, are probably going to change something. Be ready to be flexible, be ready to adapt, be ready to make changes. One of the beauties of Intuiface is how easy it is to make changes, to iterate from one version to the next very quickly and try it out again in the real environment. And finally, design tip number 10, prepare to share. This is really about the user of Intuiface itself, the people inside Composer. If you're doing it alone, you're going to use naming conventions, methods of organization that make sense to you and make sense to nobody else, right? If there's any chance whatever that somebody else will be working in this project, make sure you give everything sensible names, the assets, the collections, the triggers, the interface assets, whatever you're building inside this experience, give them clear, obvious names. The scenes in your experience, give them very sensible, logical names. If you name your scenes Scene 1, Scene 5, Scene 30, how's anybody going to know what's in those scenes? Prepare to share. If you can incorporate notes, it's a good idea. Why did you do this? What was your thinking here? In Intuiface, you might create this really nested cascade of triggers and actions, and you probably should write that down somewhere because even though you understand it, nobody else does. And finally, if you can create templates, it's a really good idea because that enables you to reproduce some perhaps complex effort very quickly. You don't have to rebuild it, and you're not making somebody that hasn't worked with you to try to reverse engineer what you did. They can grab a template, add it to the experience, and they've reproduced that very complex scenario. So those are our 10 design tips for creating amazingly engaging, interactive digital experiences. At the end of the day, you're the captain of your own ship. You don't have to do what I just recommended, but I think it's going to help you be very successful and maybe even have some fun with Intuiface.